TE Talks with Guides is a weekly podcast for lovers of history, travel, and all things Italian. Welcome back to our podcast TE Talks with Rob Allen and special guest Robert Huber. We are in part 2 of episode 5. Rob is telling us all about the Renaissance. We pick up where we left off, where he is describing what the city looked like in the 1450s.
What was that city like that he walked through? Okay, well, it's not the city that we have today, right?
No.
And we have a couple of incredible documents that testify to what that city was like. Okay, and one is a sketchbook by an anonymous artist, Italian surely, from sometime between 1490 1510, and it's the Codex Escuriolensis, and it's named after the Escurial monastery outside of Madrid, where it is found today. Okay, and we have these incredible drawings of Rome, and I'm just so in love with them. And they show us what the city was like during the Renaissance. Well, it's pretty much the medieval city still.
Sure,
that hasn't changed very much. And in one of these drawings of the Codex Escuriolensis, we see the Ponte Sant'Angelo and Castle Sant'Angelo. And it's just marvelous because, you had the only way to get to St. Peter's at this time pretty much was walking over that bridge, a bridge that was narrowed on the Vatican side by a couple of quadrangular towers that were erected for Pope Boniface IX, one of the great schism popes at the beginning of the 1400s. And Boniface IX also built the tower that is still to be seen in the center of Castle Sant'Angelo today. It's surrounded or encased by the later Renaissance structures that were started by Pope Alexander VII. Now, this drawing shows the bridge and the river at the houses going right down the river, because remember, there were no embankment walls. They were only built in the 1870s and 80s, the muraglione, to protect the city from the floodwaters. So the city's coming right down to the river, and anybody that crossed the bridge had to go through these towers. It would have rather been like, I don't know if you've been there, but Carlo Bridge in Prague. I really wish that those towers had survived. Yeah, I wish those towers had survived. But it was on this bridge that in 1450 a disaster took place during a holy year, a jubilee year, Nicholas V, right? And it's our Roman chronicler about 1490 who gives us the account, Stefano Infisura, says there were thousands going over the bridge to get to Old St. Peter's because there was going to be a papal blessing. And there was a mule with 2 baskets that began to kick savagely, and everybody panicked, and 179 people lost their lives, either because they were trampled to death, the balustrade gave way, and many others drowned. And this would lead to a whole redoing of that area, starting with Nicholas V's papacy, that leads to the Castle Sant'Angelo that we have today.
Yep. I remember that's also one of the reasons why they tore down the so-called Pyramid of Romulus to make way for the crowd. Actually, with the Jubilee.
Yeah, that was actually done that's true. But that was actually done during Alexander VI.
Yep, for 1500, for the Jubilee of 1500, so it's 50 years later.
Yeah, just before that, you're right. And that was to make the Borgo Alessandrina, which was lost due to the demolition of the Spina del Borgo, that Renaissance road was lost to create the Via della Conciliazione during the fascist period in the late 1930s.
So, go ahead.
Just one other thing about the Codex Escuriolensis drawings. There's another drawing that shows the Tiber River from the Aventine Hill, and you can see the Temple of Fortunus and the ancient cattle market Forum Barium. You can see the dome of the Pantheon, which is pretty much the tallest building in Rome at that time, and still a number of the house towers, the Cassatori, the type of medieval house tower residences of the nobility that are going to get knocked down largely hereafter to pave the way for a new type of aristocratic residence, the palace, the palazzo.
That's
Rome.
right.
So it's an amazing document. And then, of course, the other drawings are by a Dutch painter named Martin van Heemskerk, who lived in Rome from 1532 to 1536, does the most incredible drawings of the ruins of Rome, like the Forum, documenting what it was like before the 19th century excavations. There's a beautiful drawing of the Colosseum.
I totally know him very well because I used him with my part 1 of St. Peter's, the old basilica because he's
Yeah, I
also
remember
one of
that.
the documented the construction of the new church while part of the old church still remained. He's done a lot
Exactly.
of his.
And yeah, he does. He just does these brilliant drawings of the color of the Colosseum before the
Mhm.
Sperone of Stern, and the other one was added
Yeah, the
by
Stern and
Valadier.
the
Yeah,
Valadier, exactly, the
but
buttress.
the Colosseum was also referred to as the Colosseum. Culo means ass in Italian. Yeah, by in the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, this raving lunatic of a
Mhm.
sculptor who does the famous, bronze statue of
Perseus.
Perseus holding up the severed head of
Sure, and
Medusa
Florence.
in the Loggia de Lanzi in the
Mhm.
Piazza della Signoria of Florence. So anyway, and then getting back to the sort of the quirky Renaissance, the esoteric Renaissance, the belief in magic, but it could also be black magic like necromancy. Well, Benvenuto
Sure.
Cellini, who was a total lunatic,
Mhm.
really was curious about necromancy. So he knew this Calabrian priest who practiced it, and went with his buddy and the
Mhm.
Calabrian priest to the Colosseum.
Uh-huh.
And the priest draws a circle in the sand of the ground, as it wasn't excavated yet, in the where the arena was
Mm.
of the Colosseum, and
Wow.
he puts the star in it, the six-pointed star, and he begins to dance and use incense and chant. And after a couple of hours, that Benvenuto Cellini said the whole place was filled with demons, and his friend got so scared that
Mhm.
he shit himself in the Colosseum. So that's
Appropriate then that it was a
yeah.
Cubiseo. Okay.
And yeah,
Cubiseo.
so Martin van Heemskerk's beautiful drawing of the Colosseum
Mhm.
made me think about necromancy and Benvenuto Cellini.
I have that portrait. There's actually a I don't know if it's a self-portrait, but there is a portrait with him and the Colosseum in the background that I can bring over here that I use in my tour, my virtual tour.
Sure.
Well, okay, so let's just get to the point there. Okay, so you kind of painted this picture. All right, we have like a playground in a way for Renaissance architecture to be built.
Sure.
So, what besides these churches by Sixtus IV, then what comes to mind that one could still see today that was built? Because I've done a
Okay.
kind of destinations video of what I call the Renaissance Rome. Hopefully, you'll approve of it. But I'll tell you what we use as reference for the Renaissance. You could tell me what you think is still a great
Sure.
reference point.
Well, let me start off by saying that again, the papacy really saw itself as the successor to the imperial dynasty. In terms of its temporal power, of course, the successor to Saint Peter as the vicar of Christ on earth,
Hmm.
in terms of its religious authority. But the papacy, well, the first humanist Pope Nicholas V, Parente Uccelli, was Pope between 1447 and 1455. His
Hmm.
biographer Manetti lets us know that on his death speech that he gave to the cardinals just before he died, his last speech before he died, not his death speech, but before he died, tells us that the magnificent splendor of architecture is what's called for. This is what we need to inspire the ignorant masses toward faith and appreciation of the
Beautiful.
papal
Okay.
the papal institution. And although he didn't really sponsor any major building projects, that's where the ideological, you know, the nascent ideological inception of that
Hmm.
Renaissance desire for monumental architecture. And the models were, Caesar Augustus, his architectural program for ancient Rome. As Suetonius' biographer said, Augustus found a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. And then, of
Sure.
course, the great Old Testament builder Solomon, King Solomon, and the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. These were the ideas. This is what the papacy wanted to bring back again. And as one of Nicholas's architectural advisors was the great humanist Leon Battista Alberti, pretty good
Hmm.
architect himself. And he surveyed Old St. Peter's Basilica, the Constantinian church from the 4th century, determined that the southern aisle wall was a full 1.75 meters out of true perpendicular. So any shock would have certainly brought it down to the ground.
Absolutely.
And the Nicholas has the project for New St. Peter's actually started even before
Hmm.
Pope Julius II takes it up again in 1506. He has a new choir created and some new thick walls for the transepts. But then he dies, and it doesn't go any further than that just yet. But they were so substantial, these walls were 7 meters thick, that the new St. Peter's architects thereafter, from Bramante pretty much down to Antonio da San Gallo the Younger, they couldn't, they unavoidably, they had to deal with them. Only Michelangelo had them totally wrecked for that project. And of course, New St. Peter's Basilica, even though it's finished in the Baroque age, was a Renaissance. The inception of it is Renaissance.
Sure.
And it was, and so that's one place to see, the theory of Renaissance architecture. It was originally designed by Bramante as a central planned church with a dome on top of it. Of course, the dome was supposed to be, the domes in this sense are connected to the inspiration of the Pantheon.
Sure.
But Bramante also used an interesting geometry based on Euclidean fractals. And there seems to be some sort of intention to through the geometry harmonize the church with sort of cosmological principles. And as Bramante said, that he wanted to what he was intending for this colossal new church was that the vaults of what was called the Templum Pacus at the time, the Temple of Peace, it was how the Middle Ages and the Renaissance erroneously identified the Basilica of Maxentius on the edge of the Forum. Sure. But those splendid ruins that we always show our clients when we go to the Forum, splendid ruins of the Basilica of Maxentius were going to be, the vaulted aisles were going to be the support for the dome. So Bramante said that he was looking to put the Pantheon's dome on top of those vaults.
That's exactly, I totally.
And that's what he did. That's what the church ended up becoming, really, yeah.
So that you would say, even let's clarify that, since we were talking about St. Peter's, it's interesting how you point out, because I did not address really Nicholas V in the south wall. I did or Leon Battista, but I did. You would say that the Greek cross plan, like if you could take away Maderno's work on it, that would be the core of the Renaissance, because the rest of that stuff is also the problems with the architecture.
Right, that was the as with Bramante's Tempietto and the Jicculin Hill. Bramante's original New St. Peter's project is connected to the obsession of Renaissance architecture, the central plan domed church. Yeah.
Now, it's also interesting, actually. I don't know, because you mentioned the choir. I thought the choir was done under the time of Sixtus IV, because I was reading about the grottos. I have a great book about the grottos. And apparently some of the reliefs of the walls of that choir, Sixtus IV, have been preserved. They're down in the grottos in areas where we're not allowed to go to.
Some work. There was work that was continued various popes afterwards, but it was more of stabilizing what was there.
Sure.
And making more elegant. There was a new benediction loggia that was done for Pope Pius, the second, who was a Tuscan pope. But it was only, with Il Ruinante. That's what the Romans called Bramante, the great wrecker, the great ruinator. Literally, that the Constantinian Church began to be destroyed, and then Michelangelo. Any work that was done to that Constantinian Basilica from the times of Nicholas V down to his own taking over the project, that was all wrecked.
Yep. Yeah, no, definitely. So let's say, aside from the church, what about, you mentioned palaces. So are there Renaissance palaces still standing in Rome? And what would you say were great examples of the palatial, they didn't start building palaces again until the Renaissance. That's the way I was
right. We have, of course, a couple of famous Renaissance palaces. One is called today the Palazzo della Cancelleria.
Beautiful.
Because it became the papal chancellery during the times of Pope Leo X, but it was originally the Palazzo Riario, because it was built for beginning in 1483. We don't know who the architect was. For Cardinal Raffaele Riario, one of the nephews of Pope Sixtus IV, and the cousin of Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who becomes Pope Julius II in 1503. So all in the same time. Of course, this is a great age of nepotism within the papacy. If you're king, you need to have heirs. And in some cases, this involved children, and I can tell you about that as well. But Raffaele Riario supposedly was able to pay for this massive Renaissance palace that's right off of Campo dei Fiori, that uses the kind of rustication blockwork, simulated blockwork that looks a little bit like the Colosseum, and
Yep.
arched windows that are framed in
Beautiful
pilasters.
courtyard.
So very, very classically inspired, with a gorgeous courtyard inside, with a series of loggias, archways raised up on ancient columns. That was inspired actually from Brunelleschi's architecture in Florence.
Sure.
But very classical and keeping with Renaissance taste. But supposedly, Raffaele Riario won 60,000 scudi in one night's gambling against Francescetto Cibo, who was one of the 7 children of Pope Innocent
VIII.
Cibo, right? Who built the Villa Belvedere at the top of
8. Did you say 8 children?
He had 7 children.
7. Sorry, he was the 8th. So okay, well there we go.
Right,
okay,
right.
I didn't realize he had so many kids.
He had the Villa Belvedere built at the top of the Vatican Hill. Now, of course, it was pretty much known that popes were fooling around, let's say, and having children, but they were always passed off as his nephews,
sure,
his nieces. Alexander Innocent VIII's successor was Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who in 1502 was elected Pope Alexander VI, and he had a couple of official amante lovers, one of which was Venoza Catane, who was an incredibly shrewd businesswoman, by the way, and she managed hotels, which actually functioned as casse chiuse. That means brothels. So she had a number of prostitutes who were under her charge. And according to the canon of the day, she was very beautiful. She was voluptuous and blonde-haired, and very, very attractive to Rodrigo Borgia. And she ended up giving him 4 children, 4 of his 7 children. Caesar Borgia, whose ruthlessness and acuteness got him the basis. He made him the basis for the ideal prince in Machiavelli's Il Principe, the Prince. Giovanni, and then Lucrezia, the beautiful Lucrezia Borgia, who, according to contemporary accounts, maybe just to vilify her, who knows, was famous for having poisoned one of her husbands, and Geoffredo. The Venoza Catani, she was born in Rome, but she came from a family that was from Lombardy, and they were stonecutters and craftsmen. Like I said, she had this shrewd business mind, and she ran these hotels that actually functioned as kind of brothels in Rome. And the same Stefano Infessora, the Roman Chronicle, about 1490, tells us that Rome's population had grown to about 50,000 by this time, and that there were 6,800 prostitutes. And that's not even counting the secret lovers. And Machiavelli, of course, said that, well, you have so many celibate men, the priests, that's why you have so many prostitutes.
Sure, okay? Of course.
And Rome was known as La Citta delle Donne, the city of women. And she was given this one place, it's still there, right off of Campo dei Fiori on the Vicolo del Gallo. Above the doorway, the original doorway, which has been filled in, is still a coat of arms there that gives the establishment its name, the Locanda del Toro. The Locanda del Toro, cool. Because get this, on the coat of arms we have 3 heraldic emblems: the Borgia bull, her lover, the erect lion that is the heraldic emblem of her Catani family, and this other lion that's coming up from this bar, and that's the emblem of her 3rd husband. So she's got her official lover, Alexander VI Borgia, on the coat of arms, her family emblem, and her 3rd husband's emblem. Oh, and there's a compass on this as well, which seems to be a little bit interesting in a strange way. Maybe have some sort of esoteric significance, but we can't know for sure. So yeah.
So she's one of the most powerful women in Rome. She ran a business for the original pilgrims, tourists, or whoever was coming to Rome in the late 14, early 1500s, and had some of the most powerful children as well. I actually was doing
That's
a
right.
video. They call these like these new things we're going to try to do for us for UK 4K high definition. I actually walked through the city for over 2 hours slowly with a gimbal stick. But I went specifically into St. Mark's in Palazzo Venezia because she's buried there. And I went by where she supposedly is buried, which is a tomb that's right in the the narthex of the church, the open
Yeah.
portico down to the right. So I've always been a bit fascinated. Well, thank you so much about telling me more about her.
Yeah, and
Go
Rome
ahead.
was famous for its aristocratic prostitutes. These were the cortigiane oneste.
Yes.
The mysterious Lozzo Pino in his Vita delle cortigiane di Roma tells us that the word cortigiana comes from cortese dell'anno, basically courteous with your anus. And
of course, because this is a way to avoid pregnancy, probably.
Sure. And you know, there were a number of famous courtesans. One was the lover of Agostino Chigi, papal banker from Siena, builder of Villa Farnesina, Olympia. Another was Fiammetta Michelis, who was the lover of Caesar Borgia.
She still has. They still have her house.
I mean, it was very, very over heavily restored in the 19th century, but it's supposed to be her house right off of Via dei Coronati.
Exactly.
Which was actually created for Pope Sixtus IV. It means the Via dei Coronati means the rosary bead makers.
Yes.
Which was basically a redoing of the ancient Via Recta, the straight road that led from Piazza Navona to basically Castle Sant'Angelo Bridge to get over to the Vatican. And so, Fiammetta's house, tradition says anyway, who knows if it's true, is right there nearby. And then there was a Beatrice Ferraresi, who was a courtesan and reputedly the lover of Raphael, and may have been the model for his La Vallata from about 1560 down the Pitti Palace in Florence. Some think that she was also the model for the Virgin Mary, so from prostitute to the Virgin Mary, of the Sistine Madonna by Raphael, beautiful painting in Dresden. And some believe, although nobody knows for sure, that she was the model for La Fornerina in the Barberini Gallery. But others think that it may be Margherita Luti, the daughter of this baker. Thus, Fornerina means the baker's daughter. But some believe that she was the model was Beatrice Ferraresi. And George of Vasari wrote that, when Raphael died ill of high fever in 1520, it was because di averla amato troppo. Raphael had loved her too much. That's why he died. So, and Raphael's buried in the Pantheon, of course.
Yes, of course, at the young age of 37 years old.
Renaissance Rome is an age of prophecy. It's an age of, it's a city of all these bizarre occurrences, and it's a city of prostitutes, some of whom were lovers of cardinals. I mean, that's undeniable.
I think
so. Yeah.
I mean, that's great. That's this is actually quite wonderful, Robert, because we are going to be uploading this podcast in the week that we're talking about things of the Renaissance in Rome, because our destinations is the Renaissance. So I would really hope that a lot of people are able to listen to this, because thanks to you, you've actually painted a wonderful picture for us, people to have these things in mind, because the area that we're talking about, of course, is the Palazzo delle Cancelleria, Palazzo Farnese.
Another great Renaissance palace is the Palazzo
exactly.
Farnese,
So
of course.
That's where we kind of covered it. In fact, it was kind of difficult for me, and I kind of had to address it with the text in the video, because, of course, around all of that stuff is some other stuff that is absolutely Baroque or ancient, etc. But I still refer to it as the Renaissance neighborhood of Rome, because you got a lot of beautiful Renaissance gems in that area, and then it's also kind of going for what was supposedly the Via Papalis, right, from the Vatican to eventually
Yeah,
Giovanni.
and I have one last great story about Renaissance Rome
Oh, please.
that involves Pietro Arrentino, because he was from Arezzo in Tuscany, who had such a witty humor that princes and noblemen paid him to write satirical, verses about their enemies, and so that he would not write those things about them. And he eventually went to Venice and became a star in Venice because Rome got too difficult for him. I'm going to tell you about why right now. He became a friend of the painter Titian, who does this beautiful portrait of Pietro Arrentino, 1545, now in the Pitti Palace in Florence. But he wrote a number of works about prostitution and about sex, some of which were rather smutty and obscene. This is back in the Renaissance, back in the 1500s. Let us not forget that. And so he wrote a poem about the courtesan, La Cortigiana, in 1525. And he also wrote a smuttily obscene dialogue between courtesans called the Ragionamenti, that got his books put on the index of the list of banned books by the Catholic Inquisition as a result in list of prohibited books in 1558. And in 1524, while he was in Rome, he wrote the Sonetti Luxuriosi. The luxurious sonnets were about basically everything that you wanted to ever know, and things that you probably didn't need to know about sex and having sex. Okay. Now he was sponsored by, had been sponsored by Agostino Chigi at Villa Farnesina up until his death, Chigi's death in 1520. And one of Raphael's chief underling, Giulio Romano, did paintings of the positions that are described by Arrentino in the verses of the Sonetti Luxuriosi.
Oh my God, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Wow. So these erotic scenes, very pornographic. I mean, this is certainly Renaissance pornography. Mark Antonio Raimondi, who was also a friend of Raphael's and Giulio Romano's, had an entrepreneurial idea. He was a printmaker, so he said, let's make prints of these sex scenes. And they were called I modi, the modes, the ways. And that wasn't the most brilliant idea, because once the people, the Sant'Uffizio,
got wind of this.
Papal, they got wind of this, the papal court and the inquisitors, then, he was in proverbial deep shit. And so was Arrentino. That led him to go to Venice. It was a much more liberal kind of town than Rome was at the time. And obviously the artist and the printmaker, they got in trouble as well. But we have some later copies of these I modi by Giulio Romano, and they're just a riot because the figures look like they could have been painted by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel ceiling or Raphael in the Raphael rooms, except they're having sex in the most outrageous positions that you can imagine.
Oh my goodness! So I'm going to have to include this on the podcast video.
Yeah.
You have, of course, you have these. You're going to show them. You're going to share them with us, right?
And of course, Rome was considered. Well, there was the hope for the papacy that Rome was going to be the communis patria, the common homeland of all Christians. But because of all the stuff going on in the city, that just roused the ire of men like Martin Luther, who was in Rome in 1510 when he was still an Augustinian monk, and then of course 7 years later when he was back in Wittenberg, his native Wittenberg, which is Germany today, he nails his 95 thesis against the papacy up against the cathedral doors of Wittenberg, and that officially begins the Protestant Reformation.
Absolutely.
And so Luther would have seen Rome not as the communis patria, the common homeland of all Christians, but as the new Babylon, Sin City, baby. And
I always refer to it as Jerusalem, but now I'm going to be
a year later, after Luther was in Rome in 1511, another northerner was in Rome, and he was the greatest humanist scholar of Europe at the time, Renaissance Europe, Erasmus of Rotterdam. And he came to Rome to listen to the Ciceronian speeches of the papal court, which he wasn't impressed with. He thought it was overly affected and just poor. And so he wrote a satirical work against that type of oratory, Ciceronian Latin oratory called the Ciceronianus, that was published, I think, in 1528. But unlike Martin Luther, Erasmus never stopped being a Catholic priest, but he was pretty, irate, let's say, over what he saw going on in Rome when he was here in 1511. Yeah, and it goes on to write something called a satirical work called Julius Exclusus ex coli, which means Julius II excluded from heaven. And because he was in Rome during Julius's papacy, and it was printed in 1517, if I'm not mistaken. And on the frontispiece, we have this engraving. This shows Julius II with the warrior pope, because he's fighting a war against France during his papacy in the early 1500s, and he's shown at the pearly gates of heaven with his army. And it says PM, but that doesn't mean Pontifex Maximus. It means high priest, Pontifex Maximus, but Pestiferus Maximus, the greatest stinky one, or the greatest stinker, right? And he's accompanied by his evil genius. And the poem is tells how he's banging on the pearly gates of St. Peter of heaven, and St. Peter's there. And he tells St. Peter to let him in, and Peter refuses. He says, because you aren't behaving like a pious, a holy figure like you were supposed to be, but a warmongering Caesar. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And so, Julius II, sorry, if you don't let me into heaven, I'll just have my architect build me one. Obviously, this was a dig at Bramante and the new St. Peter's.
Of course.
Which was so ambitious and so colossal that, it was
shocking to people.
Of trying to commission to build heaven.
Well, Robert, I mean, this is just a wonderful beginning for us. Thank you so much for this, because like I said, it does really paint a picture. All of this stuff just enriches any kind of story or any kind of visit that anyone would love to see when they go to Rome, and if they specifically want to go through the Renaissance. I'm going to be inviting you back, because we're going to do another video about going on the Janiculum Hill, and you yourself you have done for us on a TE Walks live on Facebook that we will also be redoing on YouTube. So I'd love to chat with you about it.
Sure. In conclusion, I mean, I wanted this to be something that I think maybe would be a little bit more fun and interesting, the quirky side of the Renaissance with all these outrageous stories. But, in the areas where, these things took place around Campo dei Fiori, Castel Sant'Angelo, the Vatican, Borgo, the Janiculum Hill, the Piazza Navona, which was later Borgified, of course. But, that's where you can find a lot of the Renaissance architecture, what we have from the Renaissance in Rome. And of course, Rome eventually, after the times of Sixtus IV, when the walls of the Sistine Chapel were painted, began to eclipse Florence as the real cultural and artistic center of Renaissance Italy at the time. This continues down into the papacy of Julius II and Leo X of Medici. Takes a blow in the sack of Rome, 1527. But of course, when you come to Rome and you want to experience the Renaissance, you have to go to the Sistine Chapel and see Michelangelo's famous ceiling, and also go to San Pietro in Vincoli, where you see the tomb of Pope Julius II and Michelangelo's famous statue of Moses. The Pietà, Michelangelo's Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica.
All these things are things that we cover.
All
these things we cover in the
we cover these things. So that's
right. We have, like Federica does, the Julius II's tomb and the Moses. We have Mario going over the Sistine Chapel. We have you with the Raphael rooms, and then we have me talking about the Pietà and St. Peter's Basilica. And this is great because people can prepare when they come to Italy to see this stuff before they come to see these places. I think it gives them a great opportunity. But you've made great points, Robert. Well, thank you again so much for sharing all of this.
It was my pleasure.
And I look forward to talking to you again very, very soon. Ciao. Thank you for listening to our TE Talks with Guides. We have a new episode every Wednesday. Please subscribe to get an alert when each podcast comes out. Rate us and tell people how you enjoyed it, and share it on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Most importantly, if you enjoyed it, send us a feedback about the show. Also, if you are curious about what some of these people and places we talked about look like, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch the video on this podcast where we have inserted special images for you to further enjoy the story.